In this part of the presentation, I'm going to take kind of a deep dive into a few aspects of market economies. And this, these things are kind of technical, but I feel they emphasize key points that are useful to know. Okay, the points we're going to talk about, I'm going to look at the model of voluntary exchanges and talk about surpluses in some extent. I'm going to talk about entrepreneurs, what they are, why we think they're cool. Going to talk about the requirements of Pareto efficiency, and by God, that's a slide that's going to take us a while to get through. But there are things that need to occur, and economists assume occur in their models of markets, and that they kind of in a few words will assume all of this stuff. They'll say people are rational and have full information and costless communication. They have all these things that they assume in their models that don't work in real life, and it's kind of interesting to see what those are, what those look like in real life, and how developed economies, at least, will have dealt with them. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between capitalism, socialism, and then kind of a personal view on the difference between business and economics and the expertise that's in play in both of those. Okay, I'm going to talk about the model of voluntary exchange here. And what is this? This is the formal microeconomic model of what goes on when you buy something. So you go into a store to buy a flat screen TV. Now, bear with me on this. The diagram here tries to show that it's a line. It's a number line, starts at 0 on the left, and it goes out to C, which is the cost of production, right? So yeah, it costs something to produce the flat screen TV, and the models tend to ignore transaction costs because in retail, you got to ship that thing, you got to package it up, ship it out, and then it costs something to keep it in stock and to have somebody there to bring it up, or to have it at Amazon and to ship it to you, whatever. There are retail costs associated, but we're just going to lump that in with C. Okay, so there is a cost to get that puppy to out there where you can buy it, either whether it's on Amazon or whether it's at Target or Best Buy or wherever. And everyone, yeah, okay. Then there's also, if we move down the line, there's a P, right? A price, and that price moves around from time to time. Things go on sale, and sometimes when you buy something, you can negotiate over the price. So that's why the P is in this interval. It moves around. And that's the price, right? The price is sold, and generally it's above cost. If the supplier is going to stay in business, it better be. And the difference between the cost and the price is technically what's known as a producer surplus. Actually, it's more commonly known as profit. Now, when you look at this line, you might say, okay, I get cost and I get price and I get profit, or if you want to call it producer surplus, okay. What's this RP over here, this reservation price? And this is a key thing in this microeconomic model. Is there's this idea that consumers have a reservation price, and that is the highest price they would pay for whatever they're buying. That where they'd be, it's the point at which you're indifferent to buying the TV. That is to say, it's the point at which the money that you're giving up for the TV or whatever you're buying is, to you, the consumer, equal to the value of what you're getting. And so it's a wash to you, right? That's why you're indifferent. You're indifferent between having the money or giving it up. And generally, the assumption is, or that, for a voluntary exchange to occur, the price needs to be somewhere between the cost and the reservation price. That the actual price that's negotiated between the two people has to be between them. And so this thing comes up, this thing bothers students. When I try to present this in a class, people are going, "What's this reservation price? I don't know. I don't." It's an abstract thing. I mean, yes, I go into a store and I kind of have in my head, yeah, I have a reservation price in my head because I've learned this stuff. You probably don't. You're probably looking for the best deal. You're trying to get that price down. But, people do talk about things like price points, that people have a price point. And, so you do have an area where, hey, I'm not going to go above this. I'm not, and frankly, I'm kind of a cheap guy. And when flat screens were over $600, which, I'm old, so that I remember that. I remember these things were like $1,000. Oh, hell no, I'm not getting one of those. And then they came down below $600, and I said, now okay, right? Because I kind of understood my reservation price was up there. So the idea though is you go in and the consumer buys the product between, at something less than the reservation price, or they wouldn't bother doing it. If it costs more than that, it's better to have the money. So they don't do it. And the key insight here though is that there's two surpluses. We have this other thing there called consumer surplus. And when you buy something that is worth more to you than the money you're giving up for it, you're better off, right? You have gained value. You've traded, let's say in my mind, a flat screen TV is worth $500. I want a bigger one. I'm like, yeah, for $500, or less, I'd be happy having a flat screen. I go in and I buy one for $300, right? Woohoo! I'm in theory $200 better off, right? I gave up $300 for something that's worth $500 to me. And the key thing is that we have these surpluses, right? The producer who might have, spent under 300, if I buy it for 300, the thing might be like 250 or whatever. They make a profit. And by the way, people tend to think that there's a huge profit because they hear about markups in retail and all this other stuff. But in general, Apple has about the highest profit margin of anybody, and theirs is about 30%. Walmart's profit margin overall for all the stuff they do, 7%. So now a lot of that, on any given product, it may be more or less, probably more, but they have a lot of overhead, right? And so these guys aren't getting off, aren't really taking you to the cleaners as much as people tend to think they are. But the point is that both sides gain from the transaction. And so we have these surpluses, and the producer surplus is profit. And the key thing is that's measured. We do measure that. And there's a lot of people that take, IRS and accountants, and, there's a lot of people that are really focused on counting profit. And profit goes into, the price of the transaction goes into GDP. Every time a flat screen TV is sold for $300, GDP goes up $300. Woohoo! Because GDP is the measure of everything that's and GDP is measured at the cash register, by the way. Okay, it's only becomes value that you've created when you've actually sold the damn thing, and so it goes into the GDP. And so producer surplus profits are measured; they're concrete in that sense. Consumer surplus, on the other hand, even though economists are really big on it, in fact, kind of normatively, this is why we do this stuff, right? We make TVs so that people are better off. And how are they better off? Because they trade $300 of money for something that they value at $500. And that makes them $200 better off. That's their consumer surplus. and that makes people and that's what's good. That's good in life, right? There's an idea that we don't live to produce, we live to consume, right? That because that individuals actually benefit when they consume. You go to work and do work, you're not benefiting until you get your paycheck and spend it. Then you benefit from the work, right? So there's this idea that consumption is really important, that and is socially what we should be worried about, doing and achieving, making people better off. What could be wrong with that, right? The thing is, this is an abstract concept, right? You may never heard, it's not measured, and it's idiosyncratic. Everybody's reservation price is unique, right? For me, on the TV, it was $500. Next guy that walks in might be $450, right? Might be $7. They're really, really going crazy over it, right? Everybody's is different. It's unobservable. It's different, and in that sense, it's subjective. There is no objective measure of value in kind of the neoclassical model. Something is worth what an individual thinks it's worth. And so individuals are the arbiter of their own value judgments, right? What's an apple worth? What you're willing, there's that idea, what you're willing to pay for it. Of course, you don't pay what it's actually worth to you, right? Because you're usually buying it and gaining from it. So there's this idea that every individual has their own unobserved reservation price, and therefore it's unmeasured. We don't measure the consumer surplus that's out there, so we never really know quite how much gain there has been. And so this is one reason that it doesn't come up a lot. However, in neoclassical market economics, right, there's very much this idea that the society gains. There's a social gain, and that gain is equal to the consumer and producer surpluses, right? So let's say the flat screen TV costs $250 to make, right? So the producer takes $250 of stuff, of people's time, of physical resources, of fuel to move it, whatever. All that's the cost of doing it. They take $250 of stuff and they sell it for $300, making a profit of $50. Well, we've now taken $250 of stuff and made it worth $300. Magic, right? Boom. But this is where value comes from in the society. This is where value is created, right? Because I take stuff that's worth $250 to other people, basically, because they're selling it to you, their time, their fuel, their effort, the materials, and I make something that's worth $300 to somebody else. But guess what? It's worth more than $300. It's actually to me, it's worth $500. So you haven't just created $50 of value. You've created $250 of value. Woo! But we don't measure that second part. And why do I go through all this? It's about producing surpluses, and it's not talked a lot about. It's not in models, but it's very much a part of neoclassical economics, of Western economics, market economics, whatever you want to call it, that we produce more stuff, that value is produced, and surpluses are distributed. And so, we are creating a bigger pie, right? And when you look at it, the idea here is that value is not zero sum. There's not a fixed sum of value in the world that is distributed, and therefore, if one person gets more, another person gets less. The idea of market economics or market economies based on voluntary exchange is that surpluses are created and they're distributed. And economists tend to say, look, we want the surpluses to be created, how they're distributed, how much the consumer gets versus how much the producer gets. We like people to get stuff, but as long as the thing is created, as long as that value is created, do I care if the producer gets $50 in profit or $200 in profit, and the consumer only gets $50? Socially, the value has been created. Now, we might say we like consumers to get more, and that's why there tends to be this emphasis on, hey, we want more competition to drive prices down. And that's okay. That's a good, reasonable argument. Not core to economics. They tend to say, oh, we're not worried about that. But the key point is that this surplus value is created through the economic transaction and through, you know, putting stuff together, making a product and selling it. There is surplus value. And economists say it's not about how you divide up the pie. It's about making the pie bigger, growing the surpluses, right? And this is a huge thing that is kind of alien to a lot of people who see, especially Marxists. This is one of the big talking past each other moments between market economics. I don't like to call it capitalism, but market economics and socialism is that, hey, you're in socialism and Marxist idea, there's an objective value to a product, and there's an objective price and objective value, and the workers create it all, and if they don't all get it, then they're being alienated from their the value of it. And that doesn't fit with a essentially a subjective value through the idea that value is being created and that the people are benefiting from it and it's being distributed. Also, that's why economists, though, don't look down on profits, because they say, look, yeah, the company might have made a lot of profits, but there's a lot of consumer surplus they also made that isn't measured, right? And we're not measuring that. We don't know, but there's a lot, the profit is the value they created based on other people's judgments of the value of their product and their willingness to give the money up. And those people who gave up that money gained from that transaction. They had a consumer surplus. So economists don't get the vilification of profit. Now, you don't have to buy this, the normative side of this, but this is what's going on, and this is an important aspect of the conception of voluntary exchanges. Okay, entrepreneurs. So if taking $250 of stuff and selling it for $300 to somebody who values what you've made at $500 is awesome, we've now got a sense of what an entrepreneur does. Right? An entrepreneur is an organizer, and the term comes from Schumpeter, and he was a Austrian economist, and he coined the phrase, and he talked about he has a very kind of almost romantic language here. He talks about entrepreneurs being fiery spirits that employ a gale of creative destruction to replace inferior products or practices with new ones. And basically what an entrepreneur is somebody who comes in and says, hey, I got a better way of doing something. I can see that there's some unmet demand in the society. People really want to be able to order books from home over the internet. And so I'm Jeff Bezos, and I'm going to come up with a better way to sell books, because I look and see this, and this is innovation, right? Entrepreneurs are innovators. They tend, and kind of the way we talk about it is they see ways to take things that exist in the society that are available, technologies or materials or resources. Maybe they figure out to take a product from one physical location to another, but they figure out how to do something differently and meet a demand that hasn't been met, and they make a crap ton of money, right? And this opens up this idea of creative destruction. Once you start selling books, and oh, by the way, if you're younger than I am, which most of you probably are, Amazon was a place you went to get books, and now and then I actually order a book on Amazon and go, oh yeah, that's right, that's how this all started. Because I forget that, before we could buy everything on Amazon, it was a bookstore, and they wiped out bookstores, right? Because it's way more efficient to buy a book through Amazon, because books, the the inventory and needing to, it's easier to find them. And, I can wait a day or two and the book can ship to me. And, uh, he just put together a better way of doing it, and it wiped out bookstores. That's creative destruction. And you destroy, when you create a new way of doing things, you destroy the old way. And there's a lot of that in a capitalist or market economy. Again, I don't like using the term capitalist as much as market. And so, like I say, entrepreneurs are gap fillers. They identify, create, facilitate mutually beneficial exchanges. Whoa, we love that. And Schumpeter, in recognizing these folks and saying that this is an essential part of how we grow, he identified, or has come to be identified with, what's called Schumpeterian growth. And I'm really sorry that name is as horrible as it is, but this is, honest to God, this is a term, people use it. And Schumpeterian growth is economic growth due to innovation as opposed to employing more resources. That is to say, how can you grow your economy? Well, your economy will grow if you increase the labor supply. So you either have babies or you have people immigrate to your country. And a lot of early growth in America was we imported people. We got lots of land. We need more people. And so people came from everywhere until the early 20th century. So you bring in labor. In China, they have done a lot of growth by bringing people off the farm into the city. And by the way, that happened a lot in the United States in the 20th century. People came out of the agricultural sector and into the cities, into the manufacturing sector. So we can add people or rearrange, but generally the idea is we can add people. More often, we don't add people, we add capital. Right? So we had machinery back in the battle days when we had agricultural economies. You conquered more land. You went out and got more land. You took it from other people generally and expanded your country. Today we have reproducible capital, so you make more machines, more factories. That's great, but that's adding inputs. That's classic. That's normal growth. Schumpeterian growth is when you don't necessarily add more stuff. You figure out a better way of doing it. You say, if we went to a different inventory system, if we went to a just-in-time inventory system, that would be more efficient. We would be able to produce more stuff with the same amount of stuff, right? Of inputs. Anything you do, a better example would be perhaps Henry Ford developing the assembly line. Right? He came up with a new way of building things, and wow, that really works. Like, you could, with less people, make more cars. Woohoo! That's Schumpeterian growth. And that's important because there's this idea that developed economies, once you got all the people and you got as much stuff as you're going to get, we tend to think that more developed economies are those that are stuck with Schumpeterian growth. The only way they grow is by innovation, being more efficient. Whereas developing countries can grow by, bringing in more inputs, importing more capital. And China it would be a good example of that over the last few decades. But also developing nations around the world. Hey, we can bring in capital, and so they can go with the old type of growth. And generally, Schumpeterian growth is a little slower. Not, a little harder to do. In this model, though, notice profits are incentives to innovate. The role of profits in this system is it's the incentive to innovate. And so even if you go with Schumpeter, who's not a neoclassical, he's actually, the Austrian school of things and of economics. But profit is important in this. If people don't have an incentive to come up with with something, then they don't innovate. And so may not like it that Jeff Bezos has a lot of money, but you got to have a system that creates Jeff Bezos's, because there's other guys that want to be him, and they're out trying to figure out new ways of doing things. And so it took him a long time to get that profit, right? And most entrepreneurs aren't as successful as that, but a lot of people make money, and that's their incentive to try to come up with a new way of doing things. Okay, requirements for Pareto efficiency. I said this was going to be ugly, and undoubtedly it is. Okay, in the models of these mathematical things that economists come up with, they make assumptions about the world. They simplify things, and they say, people are rational. It's everyone's well informed. There's causeless communication. There's all these things I'm talking about that I'm going to talk about. And you got to think of that like in physics when when you study Newtonian physics, they talk about frictionless planes and things moving in a vacuum. And you're like, well, we don't have frictionless surfaces. There's, if you go into space, it's a vacuum. But, on Earth here, we pitch a baseball through air. So what's up with that? Point is that they make a lot of simplifying assumptions. But some of these things are important I think they're important to look at. So what are the requirements of Pareto efficiency? And again, Pareto efficiency means that a transaction, if a transaction is mutually beneficial, that both parties are made better off, or at least not worse off. You can have weak Pareto efficiency where one party is left the same, is indifferent, and the other party is better off. But generally, we think both people are better off. Reference the first slide about voluntary exchanges and surpluses. Okay. So what are the requirements for this to be the case? What has to be the case for us to expect that transactions between individuals, voluntary transactions, will in fact make mutually beneficial, make both sides better off? One is rationality. The people have to be trying to make themselves better off. And rationality in economics generally means that people are wealth seeking, that they're trying to make themselves materially better off in the transactions they make with other people. And the best way to understand rationality is to consider what wouldn't be rational. And here we don't mean irrational, which has a connotation of being, possessed by emotion and losing thought, right? Being irrational is incapable of thought. We mean non-rational, right? And what do we mean by non-rational? Well, the best example that you can come up with is altruism. I talked a lot about voluntary exchanges being someone trading an apple for an orange in a cafeteria, right? And there can be, it is possible that people will engage in something like that in an exchange where they'll say, oh, your banana looks really rotten, and I know you don't, I take pity on you in some way, and I say, here, have my apple. I'll take your banana. And then you just maybe don't eat the banana, or maybe just give someone the apple, right? Then it's not even an exchange, but the idea is one party is not trying, by their own choice, is not trying to make themselves better off. They're trying to make the other person better off. And in altruism is non-rational in that sense, right? And the person's not crazy. They're not overcome by emotion. They're just very nice. They're taking, but this is something that you just assume away, that people aren't like that, because, when you go to the supermarket, are you doing it? So you could say they're assuming away altruism, or you could say they're reasonably restricting their attention to these other things. But you got to have rationality. Okay, so don't get too hung up on it, but acknowledge it's there. And some people will perhaps be non-rational. And another type of non-rationality would be, well, maybe you don't really care. Maybe just follow a script in a transaction with somebody. Maybe you're doing what you think is socially necessary, and you're not thinking about your benefit. You're just thinking about I should do. What would Jesus do? Right? If you go into or an interaction with a person and use that to guide your behavior, you're not being economically rational. And I think that's fair. I wouldn't say you're being irrational. You're just following a set of norms and kind of a social script of what how you should act in that situation. And that is not being material wealth seeking. Okay. So that one aside, we have some other conditions. The next one is symmetric information. You need to have, for a transaction to be mutually beneficial, there's the assumption that symmetric information exists, right? And call it an assumption that it exists or a requirement that it exists for us to be sure it's mutually beneficial. That is to say, if I sell you something, if I give you the apple in exchange for the orange, and I know there's a worm in that apple, and the person giving me the banana in exchange for it doesn't, well, that person may not be better off as a result of the transaction. And the idea here is that we don't have to have perfect information, but we has to be symmetric. And the most obvious example of this in the real world is the concern with insider trading. And the reason insider trading is illegal is because it violates this concept of it threatens to take what should be a mutually beneficial arrangement and it turns it into an exploitive one, and where one party is made worse off to make the other one better off. And that's why the SEC is death on it, right? They go in and say, hey, you knew this stock was going to go down in value because you had information other people didn't have, and you sold it to them, and they ended up being worse off than they otherwise would have been. And they wouldn't, the idea is they wouldn't have made the transaction in the first place. So, or they would have done it at a different price. And that is, we send Martha Stewart to jail for that. We spend a lot of, we don't care who you are. The SEC is death on this. And this is part of that. Then there's the idea of costless communication. In the economic models, they always assume that everyone in the society is able to talk to one another, and when they talk about things like market clearing and the great wonderfulness of markets, their models all assume everyone can costlessly communicate with one another. Clearly, that doesn't happen in the world. Now, the way this plays out in the world is that if you reduce the cost of communicating with other people, of connecting with other potential partners in a transaction, buyers or sellers, that it makes things more efficient, right? And so something like eBay is a huge benefit because it allows people to almost costlessly, there's always a little friction, there's never a frictionless plane, but we can make some really good spray lubricant, right? Like a Christmas vacation, right? And we can make some good stuff, and it'll be great. And in real life, things like eBay, or I already mentioned Amazon, entrepreneurs come in and create a lot of things that reduce the friction out there. And eBay is a good example. Hey, I have a lime green car. Who would want to buy that? And then the commercial, and the guy who is everything in his house is lime green. Says, ooh, come to Papa. And getting people to connect gets things to the people who want it the most and are willing to pay the most for it, and it's efficient. So costless communication is something that's assumed and is kind of a friction point in markets that we want to overcome. Anonymity. Another example of the trading that goes on in kind of a very primitive way is trading of MREs, right? That, soldiers get together and they trade packets back and forth. And that example is often used. And when I was in the Army, I had the worst time eating food when I was battery commander because I was the commander of the unit. Right? Everyone worked for me, and I couldn't very well go up to my driver and say, hey, I got this cheese spread. Would you like to trade it for peanut butter? Because my driver would look up at me and he wouldn't make that arrangement based on whether he actually wanted the cheese spread, but he'd probably say, this is my chance to curry favor with the commander, so all right, here you go. And as a result of, having morals, and the Army tends to also kind of lean on you to have them. Yeah, I never traded with them, right? The only person I could trade with was my first sergeant, who didn't give a crap if I was commander or not. And so the point was that, I could not engage in this because there was no anonymity to the trade. So anonymity is about only making transactions based on the terms of the trade, right? What's being offered, what the value of everything is that's being offered, and not on other factors. And anonymity, when you lack anonymity, we can violate voluntary, the idea that voluntary transactions are all mutually beneficial. Also, if it's widespread, it's inefficient. And it's one thing about economics. Markets detest discrimination in the sense that it's inefficient. You hire the best person to do the job, and they make money. Systematic discrimination on, on other factors, unrelated, is inefficient. And it is often driven by social, legal things. It takes politics to discriminate, basically. The markets often create incentives for people to, the people who don't discriminate make more money, right? Because they're being more efficient. And so markets will tend to create these incentives. It's kind of a cool thing about them. But although people, will put laws and social rules into effect to try and resist it, but the markets tend to be the troublemakers for those guys, because they always create this incentive. No, go higher. Because the sad fact, it's not because people are wonderful. It's just, if the sad fact, or happy fact, depending on how you look at it, is a group of people that's discriminated in a society is getting paid less, and if they're being discriminated on the basis of irrelevant factors, hey, they can do the work, and if you hire them, you get to pay them less, and you get better stuff, and you make more money, right? So it's not for any kind of moral value, but that hey, I can make more money. There's a great part of Schindler's List where he, chooses to use the Jewish laborers in the movie, and he says, well, Jews are cheaper. And, he is selfishly motivated to get them. Then he gets them, and then he gets nice. Okay. The point, though, is that the market creates that pressure. I'm not saying it's going to make the world utopia, but it's kind of a cool thing that markets do. They don't like anonymity. It's more efficient, or the lack of anonymity. They abhor discrimination. Anonymity is efficient, and that's cool, kind of a cool thing. Okay, you got to have defined property rights. You got to have the right to buy and sell stuff. And that is something I mentioned, that you have to have these things out there and defined, and people have to have title to things for a transaction to even occur. And sometimes it's a matter of the political system not giving people rights. A lot of the Ethiopia famine was driven by the fact that the land was redistributed to people, to small farmers, but they weren't allowed to buy or sell it. And so it was inefficiently distributed, and a lot of people abandoned their farms because they couldn't make a living. And the other farmers couldn't buy the land except, surreptitiously using it. And so you had a weakening of agriculture in Ethiopia that, a drought eventually wiped out. And so not having property rights can be a big problem. Also, you have to define rights in property. There's a lot of things that become scarce. Once something, when something's really, really abundant, you don't define property rights in it. There's no property rights in air, right? There's a lot of it around, and we don't own air. But if air ever becomes scarce, we're going to have to do something about that, right? And you're probably going to define rights in it, and create define people's ability to exclude others from using it. Examples of this, a classic one that was studied was airport landing slots. That there was at first when airports were built, people just landed whenever because there weren't that many planes. And as time grew on, you had to create the concept of a landing slot and then sell it to airlines. And because there were more planes wanting to land than there was room, and you had to create this. Another thing, other examples are the electromagnetic spectrum. Frequencies have to be, that had to be broken up, defined, and then, rights in it defined, and then a system set up for people to trade it. And governments frequently have to do that. The last thing is quality has to be known. You need to know the quality of the products, and you have to be able to define that, and that becomes a big issue. And if if you don't know the quality of a product, then it's hard to come up with a transaction, and you can end up not having a transaction occur. And the classic example is used cars, that it's very hard to tell the quality of a used car. And so people tended to be leery of buying them. So people who had perfectly good used cars couldn't sell them because they knew what the car was worth. They're like, no, I'm not going to sell this car for, the price of a junker, because it's a decent car. Yet people would go, well, I can't tell. So I'm going to assume it's a junker. I'm going to, I'm not going to give you the price that it's worth. And there's actually a whole bunch of game theory that shows that this process will end up in a market for lemons where only junkers are offered and sold, but we don't want to go too far into that. The idea, though, is because you can't measure the quality in that case, it's hard to trade the product because we just don't know, right? And people aren't willing to pay what it's worth, and therefore people aren't willing to offer it for that. And so knowing quality is important. And again, we do have entrepreneurs are out there trying to solve that, saying, hey, let's come up with a system of tracking cars and make people more confident that the car they're getting is better. And so Carfax comes into existence, and it works on that problem for that. There are other ways to deal with known qualities. Consumer Reports gives you information on the quality of cars, and that's a big help, and that's an entrepreneur going out and filling a gap. There are other things like brand names help you to understand, hey, this is probably pretty good, and I'm a little more confident. I don't know for sure, but there's a reputational effect. So there's a lot of ways that we can deal with that. And again, through all of these things, these are a lot of complications. And if you think about these kinds of things and look at how the transactions you engage in and you see around the world, you see that there's been a lot of stuff created, a lot of institutions and entrepreneurs creating products or services to deal with these problems. And this is a lot of what goes into making a modern, developed, there we call it developed. It's a little bit jarred to say developed and undeveloped, but what's developed is creating all of these things, adding them in, defining property rights in weird stuff like electromagnetic spectrum or URLs, right? They had to do that at one point. And coming up with all these services and things to support transactions. And that's a lot of what goes into making the economy, a modern market economy, work. Okay, capitalism. What is capitalism? Well, there's two things. There's two things here. Capitalist economies tend to be to my mind, that the defining characteristic is a market distribution of resources, that we have markets deciding, putting a price on things, buying and selling the resources in the society, and therefore, assigning values and distributing the resources accordingly. There's also the aspect of it that goes along with that and gives it its name, is the private ownership of capital. Now, okay, the first point, right? If you have markets distributing resources, well, guess what? Capital is a resource, and so if the market distributes it, it's distributing it for private ownership. Okay, and so I always like to say the first point implies the second. But the name capitalism emphasizes the second characteristic, the existence of these capitalists, right? One percenters, whatever, name we're screaming from the barricades this week. And this is why I don't like using the term, is because I think it's kind of emphasizing a secondary point, is burying the lead. The lead is market distribution of resources. So socialism, theoretically, if it's actual socialism, and people throw that word around a lot, usually in a negative context, it theoretically focuses on public ownership of capital. And in fact, if you aren't talking public ownership of capital, you ain't socialist, okay? I always say back to that old phrase, I know socialists and you are one. That's a really old quote about John Kennedy, but that's kind of where I come from this. Maybe that's personal, I don't know, but I offer it to you. And the problem with socialism, right, public ownership of capital, um, is that, or typically the countries that are socialist end up interfering in market prices and distribution, right? There have been attempts to have public ownership of capital and that don't do that, right? And Sweden is a good example. Sweden, there have been a lot of attempts of governments taking over businesses, running things, especially after World War II. A lot of governments nationalized industries that they considered core, like coal mining, and the Europeans were big on this. They nationalized their railroads, and they nationalized coal mines, and a lot of countries nationalized their oil industry, and that is to say, they take public ownership of the industry. And however, the countries you really consider socialist, like the USSR and the communist countries of old, they did away with market distribution, i.e. prices and profit. They kind of wiped all that out. And when you take away the market distribution, all hell breaks loose, right? I could go and, I'm asserting that, okay? But, and once you start saying, oh, you can't charge what it's worth, you can't charge a market price, then we get shortages, we get black markets, we get, just kind of craziness. A good example where I see a good split here is China. China on the board. Hey, we're a social. We're not socialists. We're communists, right? We're the People's Republic of China, and we are communist. They have most of their reforms have been about putting markets back into their system, right? They frequently, they get a bottleneck, they have a problem over the past few decades. Their answer has been, all right, we need to deregulate. We need to, you can't even call it deregulate. We need to create markets. We need to free this up and allow it to be traded. And the privatization of capital, they've kind of been slow on. They still have public ownership of a lot of capital, and you still need to get permission through things. And so they've been a lot less, they've been slower to change that. In contrast, Venezuela has made itself out to be a socialist country, and other than, well, they didn't even their oil industry was pretty much, I think, nationalized ahead of time. But if they did something, they nationalized their oil industry, right? That was the industry they nationalized and took over. But then as they're creeping, the things that they did after that have brought them to the chaos they've got now is they started taking away market things. Right? They started putting price controls and telling people, oh, you can't sell bread for more than this, and then there's no bread. And they started going after the private manufacturers and really started messing. And God, what really screwed them up is they started screwing with their exchange rate, right? Trying to control that and mandate a different exchange rate, which just screwed up all their international trade. And so, they've largely, it might be an exaggeration to say they've exactly done the opposite, but I think there we have a big difference in two countries that call themselves socialist. And I think you're seeing the natural results of that. If you screw with market, screw with prices, it just starts going downhill big time. And you end up in Venezuela's position, whereas China, not so much. They've got problems, and these problems are going to come out in the surface over the next few decades, especially ghost cities. Over, their high savings rate has led them to overinvest in things, and so they're going to have a lost decade, which is something that's happened to a lot of Asian countries and other countries. In countries in Latin America, not other countries, in other Asian countries and countries in Latin America. But they've, they're going to have some slow growth as they have to write off the cost of all these projects, expensive projects they've invested in. But I'd rather have that problem, than Venezuela's problem right now. Well, maybe not, except Venezuela's problem's easy to fix. Put the markets back. My point here is that we want to look at that, and I think it's important to emphasize the markets over the capitalism, because I think that's what's more important. Again, that's more of a gut feeling after studying this, so I offer it to you with no authority, something for you to think about. Business versus economics. Here's another gut thing, another personal observation, but business is one side of the equilibrium equation, as it were. They're producers. And society is made up of producers and consumers. And so business men, people, and business interests are, they don't have the whole picture, and their interests are only one side of the total story, one part of the society. And there's a lot of things that businesses do that kind of don't jibe with how the economy works. For instance, businesses compete with one another, right? But producers and consumers cooperate. And so businesses and business persons will tend to see things through a competitive zero-sum lens that doesn't necessarily jibe with how economists see things through a cooperative positive sum. Hey, it's about surpluses. It's about growing the pie. And so that's a big difference that people have. Also, businesses, when you have business people, you always say, hey, they're experts in business, not in economics. So I guess the big thing I'm saying here is just simply that business persons are experts in business, not economics. And sometimes when we get in these debates, the business interests are afforded a perception of expertise that when you're making policy, I mean, you never want to disregard those, because special interests are interests nonetheless, right? And so by all means, we listen to business when they talk about things, and talk about things that affect them. But at the same time, sometimes when folks are saying, well, my experience in business is kill or be killed, and you just think, well, I don't know, that's not kind of the way the models work. And so you just want to keep that in mind, and that's a point I just am throwing out there for folks in general.